Sonic Frontiers has finally come upon us, and I have finally had the chance to play it for myself. I could do a standard review of the game like everyone else has done to satiate the 10 people who genuinely want to know my personal thoughts, which are subject to change due to recency bias, but nah, I don't feel like it. However, I'll say that one thing I always found striking about Sonic Frontiers is the insistence from Sonic Team that it'll lay the foundation for future Sonic games in the next 10 or 20 years. In a series notorious for radically shifting its gameplay trajectory at the drop of a hat, it's honestly kind of surreal to see Takashi Iizuka state outright that they're planning on sticking to a specific direction for the foreseeable future. Reception to Sonic Frontiers has been somewhat contentious, but overall more positive than not, especially among Sonic fans, indicating that this new format is promising but has room to improve, so I think it's worthwhile to talk about what those improvements could look like. For that reason, I've decided to make this video to talk about what I think a sequel or follow-up to Sonic Frontiers should change or add to make it the best it can be. Also, to whom it may concern, yes, this video will contain spoilers on Sonic Frontiers. To be blunt, if you haven't played the game yet, then this video is not made for you. With that said, what might a sequel to Sonic Frontiers have in store? To answer that question, we should establish what Sonic Frontiers was trying to achieve in the first place. Put simply, the main goal here was to take Sonic's gameplay and give it more open-ended design, but this begs the question of what Sonic's gameplay even is, since it's changed a lot over the years. Bear with me for a minute. Sonic's stages in Sonic Adventure, as many people, myself included, have explained, took the cornerstones of 2D Sonic control and design and transitioned them as directly as they could into a 3D environment. The way Sonic reacts to terrain and his spin dash and roll abilities mesh with the loose, slope-filled stage design. Sonic Adventure 2 would go on to take that same physics-based control scheme and put it in environments where it's practically useless. Levels don't bend around on themselves nearly as much, and most slopes go downwards, making the spin dash only really function as a burst of speed rather than a tool for exploiting the layout. Instead, the levels put a greater focus on action and spectacle, which I think is fun in its own right, but to be honest, feels a bit unrefined in SA2 specifically. There aren't many mechanics added to Sonic's kit to facilitate this change in level design, and the ones that were added, such as the somersault, feel a bit clunky to use. Enter Sonic Unleashed, which overhauled Sonic's control setup so that every button has a different function meant to make sure that Sonic doesn't suck, no matter what obstacles block him on his linear path. This control and design setup will carry over to Sonic Colors, Generations, and Forces. Now we make our way to Sonic Frontiers. The gameplay no longer takes place in hallways filled with obstacles, aside from that, but we'll get there, and instead has you running around a truly open environment, yet the mechanics have not been completely rethought following Forces. This is what I believe to be the root of all the debates about momentum, the abundance of dash panels and rails and stuff in the open zone, and so on. Now, I don't mean to say that they just threw Forces Sonic in an open world. That would be giving too much credit to Forces' controls, since there are plenty of changes to the handling and button mappings, as well as a couple of added moves here and there. When looking at the whole control scheme though, it has more in common with the boost games than any other 3D Sonic playstyle. I have mixed feelings on this. On one hand, I'm glad the Sonic team didn't pull another Sonic Lost World and completely toss out every gameplay element the series had constructed up to that point, but on the other hand, I don't believe this control scheme was meant for an open world. I'd argue that's a part of why the initial gameplay reveals were so contentious. These mechanics are contextual by design, so when you show off this gameplay with no context, it's not gonna look as appealing, but it shouldn't have to be that way. Besides being able to pick and choose the content you want to engage with, the appeal of having an open playground like this is being able to express yourself as a player and do creative things with the controls and mechanics without having to worry about reaching an end goal. I'm not saying that Frontiers has none of this appeal. I'm sure people who are better at the game than me would attest to that, but much like SA2's speed stages, I don't think it's at its full potential. So, with all of that laid out, how could we change Sonic's control to make traversing and messing around in the world more fun than it already is? Let's start with the physics and handling, which the game already lets you tweak yourself but could still use some changes even with that in mind. For some reason, the top running speed when not boosting, even with the highest level speed and the slider set to max, is pretty slow compared to other games in the series, so I think they should bump it up a bit. I understand that some people would find it unwieldy for the base movement to be so high, but, well, that's what the sliders are there for, right? Just make it halfway by default. There should maybe also be a slider for deceleration when you let go of the stick, since to some people, but not everyone, it comes off as unnatural to stop on a dime right after boosting. Sonic should also react more naturally to slopes and terrain, which I think is self-explanatory. Previous boost games didn't really need super accurate slope physics because you had a button to instantly propel you to max speed, and because the level geometry wasn't as complex or organic. In Frontiers though, it looks kinda goofy for Sonic to jitter around when running on rocky terrain, or run up cliffs with little resistance, or fly a good distance from jumping off rails but not regular terrain. As for Sonic's moveset, Let's take what he already has in Frontiers as a baseline and tweak things from there. You're already able to roll in 3D in this game, but only by using the drop dash for some reason, and you have to press the jump button 3 consecutive times to do it, making it a bit cumbersome. If we're gonna go out of our way to add the drop dash, why not take things a step further? I would take a page out of Sonic Lost World's playbook and map the drop dash, spin dash, and rolling to the left trigger. Press it from a standstill to spin dash, press it while running and you roll, and hold it in midair to drop dash. These changes would give traversal more depth than just holding the boost button, and it would help to unify the boost control scheme with the Adventure and Lost World scheme so that the game doesn't feel like Boost Sonic in an open world, but just Sonic in an open world. As is, all the left trigger does is the Sonic Boom, which is a move that should have been tweaked anyways, but I'll get to combat in a minute. Now, should the boost stay? That depends. Would it be made obsolete by the spin dash or vice versa? Evidently, I'm not the only one to ask this question. Personally, I think if there's enough sense of give and take, you could have both as options. The spin dash can defend against enemies but requires brief charging, while the boost comes out instantly but runs on a limited meter. They could also just make the boost flat out better than the spin dash, but only have it be usable when you've reached a certain number of rings, which, by the way, should probably just have been kept as 400 rings no matter your max ring limit so that you're not discouraged from upgrading it. They could also combine the two into one move, kind of like how the boost worked in the Wii version of Unleashed. The possibilities are never ending. Is having the boost preferable to the movement in, say, the Sonic Adventure games where your standard running can go just as fast if you let it? That's a little more subjective, but in a game where you cross large swaths of terrain, it might be worth having a button to instantly shift into high gear. The other mechanics can stay, I suppose, but there are some changes I'd make to improve the overall flow. First, you should be able to boost out of a roll at any time like you could in the Sonic Rush games. Next, I think Sonic's punch and kick should not halt your movement since they're mapped to the same button as the homing attack, a move that launches you forward, and the lightspeed dash ought to keep your forward movement going when it's finished. As is, these moves kind of break the pace when you use them. Going off my previous suggestions, they could also remap the jump stop to stomping while holding the left trigger rather than just holding the stomp. The slide should also be made more useful somehow since it feels a bit superficial in Frontiers and would probably be even more so if a roll button was added. Perhaps it could be made into some kind of brake function like the hints tell you it is, since it's mapped to the same button as the stomp, which is meant to stop you in midair. I'd also map the air tricks to a button rather than pressing different directions on the analog stick so that you wouldn't have to sacrifice midair control when you're launched into the air. Then there's the side loop, which I think could just be a game-specific mechanic that the next game may not even include. We'll probably get something different in its place, maybe a different move, maybe a cool new transformation, maybe Sonic will get a sword again, who knows. I just hope it's a little better balanced next time. The way the side loop can just generate rings and other collectibles with no real limitation devalues exploration a little when you can just spawn whatever you need by drawing circles in the dirt. Not only that, but it makes combat a lot easier when you can basically generate health restores at a moment's notice. Don't take what I just said to mean that the combat isn't engaging though. In fact, I'd say Sonic Frontiers has the most solid approach to meshing in-depth combat elements with Sonic's signature gameplay that I've seen. The homing attack, quick step, side loop, stomp, and other moves carry over to Sonic's battle style, giving it a sense of retention with the non-combat gameplay. Many of the Guardian bosses also have you go through a gauntlet involving rail grinding or quick stepping or something like that before you can get your hits in, and even the ones that don't tend to have multiple ways to deal with them, compared to the Werehog from Sonic Unleashed, which literally used a completely different control scheme, or even the combat from the 3D Spark the Electric Jester games where the platforming abilities have little application in combat and vice versa. Sonic Frontiers' approach to beat-em-up gameplay in a high-speed platformer is the best we've gotten yet in my opinion. Despite these merits, to me this comes off as the weirdest facet of the gameplay loop since you've got this elaborate system in place for something that's often considered vestigial in the greater Sonic series. Maybe that's why it's as developed as it is. Because it was the toughest pill for the focus testers to swallow, they had to keep making it more robust. It still makes me wonder, will every major 3D Sonic game from now on incorporate beat-em-up action, or will they move on from this element that they put so much thought and effort into and that plenty of people enjoyed? Well, since the goal here is to build on Frontiers' fundamentals, it's most likely going to stick around for the next game at least. In terms of improving it for the next game, the main thing I'd suggest would be to nerf Sonic's defensive options. I already mentioned the side loop and how you can use it to get rings whenever you want, but even if you ignore it, you're still not at much risk of losing all your rings since you can usually just re-grab them over and over. To be fair, most other Sonic games have this same issue, but what's unique to Frontiers is that you can use the lightspeed dash through your dropped rings to recollect them all at once. couldn't do that in Adventure 2. My solution to this would be to remove the ability to light dash on scattered rings and to make them fly further the more you get hit so that you can't re-grab them as easily. The other thing to nerf would be the parry. As cool of an addition as it is, most other action games require you to time the button press correctly for the best results. Not so in this game. I think holding the bumpers should function as a standard guard to block attacks, while the witch time parry effect only comes out if you time the guard well enough with enemy attacks. Similar to other stylish action games, you can unlock additional skills through experience dropped from enemies and upgrade your stats using collectibles found throughout the overworld, though you have to find the Elder and Hermit Cocos to utilize these. This system works as is, but there could be some tweaks. First, the Elder Coco, or whatever equivalent the next game has, should be allowed to increase your stats by several levels at once somehow because, well, you know. Second, I would have liked it if you could somehow get Seeds of Defense and Power by trading in your skill points, since I unlocked all the skills in the game well before the end, leaving me with dozens of skill points I couldn't use. Now, I have heard some people take issue with the fact that you can easily get every skill before the end of the game, saying that the skill tree in Sonic Frontiers is too small and could have used more moves. While I don't disagree, I think it's more important to change the properties of the moves we already have. For one thing, I think it would just be fun to see a new set of techniques that's both familiar and different for each game, but for another thing, the skill set we got in Frontiers is not perfect. A few too many moves serve the same function of a flashy finisher with the camera making a bunch of fancy pans around, and while that's cool for a few moves, it gets repetitive when pretty much every skill you get is like this. Even on the cosmetic level, some of these are too similar. The Sonic Boom just feels like a weaker version of the Cross Slash, and the Spin Slash is a lot like the Cyclone Kick except with a ball formation. For the next game, there ought to be a little more variety in how the moves work. Maybe have skills that are designed for crowd control, maybe ones where you grab and throw enemies, just to name a couple ideas. Certain moves like the loop kick and the stomp attack could also be made quicker and easier to integrate into your standard combos. There should also be a style system of some kind to encourage you to use all these different moves instead of just using the same one over and over. The button mapping should also be tweaked a bit to not conflict with the standard movement control. I've had instances where I accidentally used the spin slash and homing shot on basic homing attack fodder in a platforming section. Besides having more specific button combinations, one solution would be to make certain moves only be usable if you use the right analog stick's lock-on feature. On the enemy design side of things, I think there should be a little more variety, not just in how many enemy types there are, but in how you take them down. It did get a little repetitive to see the ninja and tower archetypes show up on later islands, but they're nonetheless a solid blueprint to go off since there isn't any specific way you need to defeat them, and because you can theoretically deal damage to them as soon as the encounter starts. In a weird way, the tower boss reminds me of the bosses in the classic games. They could also change up the enemy groups so that you're not just fighting single shells or groups of soldiers throughout the overworld. What if, say, you were fighting a bubble that was surrounded by soldiers or two of the sniper enemies from Ares Island at once, or something like that? Of course, I simply can't talk about the combat in Sonic Frontiers without mentioning the supersonic boss fights against the Titans. Actually, maybe I can, since the first draft of this script didn't even mention them. In Frontiers' base form, these are already some of the most spectacular parts of any Sonic game ever. And if they simply reused this idea in the next game without any notable changes, it may lose its magic. But then again, if there isn't anything like these battles in the next game, it might look inferior to Frontiers, won't it? So what do? Well, they could bring back the concept of recurring supersonic boss fights, but have them come in a different flavor. What if he could actually be Super Knuckles and see how much faster he'd make things? Or instead of bosses the size of skyscrapers, what if there were rival battles between two superpowered characters? They don't have to use those specific ideas, but I still want to see them get creative with the use of Supersonic. These fights could also use some more mechanical depth and challenge, with a larger pool of attacks the bosses can use against you. More importantly, the final boss should actually serve as a test of the skills you've been building up over the course of the game rather than just an Ikaruga clone. Hoi. With Sonic's gameplay out of the way, let's get into the world itself. Sonic Frontiers is divided into 5 separate islands that you go through in order, so you'd expect the same setup for the next game, right? Well, not necessarily. Much like how there were plenty of different ways they structured past 3D Sonic games, there are plenty of ways they could structure another open zone game. They could take the same approach of 4 or 5 moderately large areas, though in that case I hope they don't reuse aesthetics the way they did with the last couple of islands. And if there was some equivalent of Rhea Island, I'd personally prefer it if it was the last area rather than the second to last area. It would have made for an excellent climax and skill check. If not that, then they could do a singular, larger, interconnected world to fully capitalize on the openness that Frontiers teased. As a third option, and my personal favorite, they could do a mix of both. Half the game consists of multiple separate areas, but half points where they naturally connect, sort of like a Metroid game. Remember when people were theorizing that you'd have to return to Kronos Island at a later point in the story because there was a section blocked off? What if they actually ran with that idea? Progression between zones could be somewhat non-linear, and you'd be encouraged to go back and forth between islands to access new areas. A similar idea I had was using a central open zone as its own hub area connecting to several smaller zones to explore. This idea seems natural for the kind of game Sonic Frontiers is. Despite the clear aesthetic parallels you could draw between these areas and Breath of the Wild or Death Stranding or whatnot, I've seen the gameplay style be compared to collectathon platformers, having progression be tied to finding a certain number of goodies, and I for one am perfectly fine with that. I'd like to mention that I've played more collectathons than I have open world games, making that my more common point of comparison. Exploration is a tenet of Sonic that's become less and less prominent over time, and I think a part of that is because the removal of limited continues and special stages has lessened the incentive to explore, especially when you're expected to just go fast. Or it's Unleashed, where you have to arbitrarily collect medals in stages that throttle you forward. I think having the gameplay revolve around exploring for things is a brilliant idea. It prevents these open zones from feeling like you're just running across a field to get to the next waypoint, and the game makes collecting things a key part of the engagement rather than something just there to pad out playtime. The memory tokens encourage you to comb through the environments, while portal gears and vault keys reward you for taking on more significant challenges. There's still potential for speedrunning, but it involves finding the most optimal route in addition to going fast. One key difference between those collectathons and Sonic Frontiers is how in the former, the collectibles are in limited supply. Super Mario 64 only has 120 power stars, Spyro the Dragon only has 80 dragons, etc. Sonic Frontiers' main collectibles for progression are the aforementioned memory tokens, portal gears, and vault keys, and you could literally get more of all these things by pre-ordering the game, or fighting enemies, or drawing shapes with a side loop, as I've said. This is probably just a personal complaint, but I feel like this cheapens their value. Rather than that, I would make the way you obtain these main collectibles more deliberate. They should be limited in quantity, meaning that you can't get infinite portal gears by refighting bosses, or infinite memory tokens using the side loop, nor should they be given to you as random drops from enemies. Maybe preset drops from enemies? The collectibles should also be paced out better. For one thing, either remove the treasure chest signs or make them harder to find because they're pretty unbalanced as is. You can either go through a platforming gauntlet for 1 memory token or do a single side loop around these signs and get 8. For another thing, I'm not entirely sure why you're given 3 additional keys for completing every mission in a cyberspace stage. Isn't getting all 4 keys in itself enough of a reward? Then of course there's Big's Fishing, which lets you more or less cheese the game by buying loads of these collectibles. This can be solved somewhat by limiting how many you can buy, which the game might already do, and perhaps making them more expensive. Obviously, the item requirements should be balanced around these changes. Another thing those collectathons usually get right is having natural platforming in the environment, and Sonic Frontiers stumbles here. Likely a result of the many reworks during Frontiers' development, many of the platforming segments in the open zone feel very tacked on, floating in midair and made up of the same platform prefabs stitched together in various ways. This also goes back to what I was saying about how Sonic Frontiers carries over the sensibilities of the Boost era titles. A lot of the bits and pieces used in these platforming sections are just ported over from those games. Rails, dash rings, directional cannons, bars you swing off, walls you jump between, etc. And they pervade through the whole game. In essence, these bits of level design are small slices of spectacle platforming, except with less spectacle and lower stakes, so what you're left with can feel shallow and automated. Generally, these parts are at their most satisfying when you're able to link between them and do mini sequence breaks, but even that feels largely unintentional. For the next game, the world design should play more to the strengths of the gameplay style. Terrain should be clearly designed and built with this kind of platforming in mind, so that these bits are less intrusive and are a natural part of the environment. Doing this can add more nuance to the platforming by more easily letting the player use slopes and terrain to their advantage, jump from one challenge to another, and approach these segments from different angles. There are also some changes I'd make to further enhance the sense of discovery. For one, have more secrets to uncover. A lot of what you interact with in Sonic Frontiers is out in the open and not really hidden, so having more Easter eggs that a first-time player would never look out for would make exploration even more rewarding. For another, have more unique set pieces between islands to keep the player wondering what they'll encounter next. It could range from over-the-top mise-en-scenes like the tornado in Windy Valley or the cannons in Bullet Station, to little things like the conveyor belts in Quartz Quadrant, the spinning tubes in Final Chase, the lollipops you swing on in Sweet Mountain, etc. The Boost games with their speed and reflex-focused design have kind of devalued these mechanics, but I think the open zones would benefit from continually introducing new surprises like this. People tend to criticize Sonic Frontiers' gameplay loop as as being repetitive, but I don't think the problem is necessarily the gameplay loop itself, since I don't see how it's any more repetitive than the act structure of previous games. I think the problem is just that there aren't enough set pieces to distinguish each zone. Besides combat and platforming, there are also various challenges that reveal parts of the map. I don't have much to say on them besides that I wish they were more consequential. What do I mean by that? Well, first, they could have had more variety and creativity. I'd like to see more minigames similar to what you sometimes do for Amy, Knuckles, or Tails to get some of the Chaos Emeralds. On that note, there could have been better rewards for finishing the challenges. Seeds of power and defense are fine, but I kind of wish the harder activities gave you progression items like the memory tokens or vault keys, or maybe even opened the way to other stages, kinda like the rail puzzle on Kronos Island. Finally, these challenges should have been a little more, well, challenging. Give them stricter thresholds and time limits, at least on harder difficulty settings. On a side note, I wish the difficulty settings affected more than just the combat, or the final boss. Seriously, what was even the point of locking the true final boss behind hard mode? This feels like something they would have done in the 90s, except it's not because you can just change the difficulty mid-game, making it basically pointless. Whatever. All those elements of the open zone are pretty general, but I also want to touch on some specific issues with Chaos Island. This third island is, in a sense, Sonic Frontiers' Labyrinth Zone, a, shall we say, unpopular concept that the next game should rethink. The biggest problem is that almost every platforming section on the island is a 2D section for no compelling reason. This just makes these sections more restrictive and harder to exit if you accidentally enter one, and I really don't like the treasure chest signs that trick you into being thrust into one of these sections. I'm not entirely against 2D sections in the overworld, but I'd rather see them be handled like they are on Kronos and Ares, where they're a genuine surprise when they show up. The way Chaos Island handles them is intrusive and repetitive. This island may have used 2D sections so heavily to feel different from the other islands, but I've already gone over more productive ways they could have achieved this. Chaos Island is also structured in a rather confusing way, since some of the Chaos Emeralds are tucked away on side islands, but maybe some people dig that. In theory, I think that's a fine way to shake things up for the third island. Again, it's not something to ditch, but rather rethink in how it's handled. Now, even with my criticisms, I will say that in terms of pure gameplay, these open zones knock the stuffing out of whatever the hub worlds of previous games are trying to do, since there's actual gameplay substance and progression isn't strictly linear. The only thing I think takes away from the feeling of freedom is that the game guides you towards the story events and Chaos Emerald vaults in a set order, but the former was probably necessary for this particular story, and the latter can be worked around with enough vault keys. However, one thing the hub worlds of previous games had going for them was that they felt very lived in, with plenty of people to interact with. The worlds of Sonic Frontiers, meanwhile, have been berated for feeling empty and desolate, even with all the things to do in them. I think setting the next game in some sort of city or a small town location would help to mitigate that, since you'd have a bunch of NPCs to talk to and maybe even do missions for, as opposed to just Sage or whoever else you're trying to feed memory tokens to. It might even allow for more platforming built into the environment like I mentioned earlier, since said environment would have more man-made structures to bounce between. Ooh, what if it was like a city in the sky, so you could justify having a lot of floating structures? Sorry, that's a little too specific. Actually, I think it came to mind because I want to see more unique ideas for environments like it, since Frontiers' locales are a little uninspired. I'll say that I don't mind a somber tone or realistic art style for Sonic. Every 3D Sonic game prior to Lost World tried to feel real in their own way, but the problem is that the locales don't have much identity besides grass, desert, volcano, brass again. Granted, they get a fair amount of mileage out of those archetypes, but it still can't help but feel generic. It used to be exciting to go into a new Sonic game and wonder what sort of creative and diverse new ideas for the environments the team had come up with, from huge oil refineries and carnivals to roller coasters over green lava and spooky mountains in the shape of pumpkins, but that spark has been missing from Sonic games since 2011, jeez. On the topic of wanting creative new environments, when it comes to things to overhaul in a Sonic Frontiers sequel, the first thing to come to many Sonic fans' mind is cyberspace. A surprising amount of leakers and journalists were hyping this component as a highlight of the gameplay, but when the fans first saw it...
Whoa! New greenhouse zone.
Yeah. For a game that prides itself on being an evolution of Sonic's gameplay, it really sticks out like a sore thumb when you have a section of the game that is so magnetized to the past in every conceivable way, especially when reused level themes was possibly the most criticized aspect of both the last main Sonic games. We were already sick of Green Hill and Chemical Plant by the time Forces came out, and now that sickness is terminal. Frontiers even takes it a step further by reusing level layouts from previous Sonic games, so you're not far off from literally playing Sonic Generations again. Now, maybe many newer fans wouldn't be able to tell all this, and even as a series veteran, I can respect the idea of using the familiar to ease people into the new. However, suffice to say, we do not need this for the next game. The easiest solution would be to just remove these stages altogether in the next game and allow it to fully commit to this new open-ended format, but then what would you do for the people who don't care for the open world stuff and just want point A to point B Sonic action? Maybe they could leave the linear 3D Sonic format to a side series, much like how in the aughts there were 2D games developed separately from the 3D ones, but on Sega's end, having a separate team work on linear 3D Sonic games would either require splitting Sonic Team or getting a separate team that would be able to easily work with what Sonic Team has laid out. Perhaps these are possible, but neither sound like the most straightforward process, and I can't say that it would surely be worth it anyways. Frontiers already has an arcade mode to allow the people who prefer the old style of 3D Sonic to play the cyberspace stages in a vacuum. All you really need is an option to play them all sequentially like the Egg Shuttle mode from Colors, and you're set. Even taken as a part of the greater open zone experience, I personally felt as though the cyberspace stages added more than they subtracted. It was nice to have these occasional quick thrills to diversify the gameplay without overhauling the mechanics, but something else not a lot of people talk about is the way the missions and vault keys work. A lot has been said about how crucial the ranking system is in how second generation Sonic games are designed, since it encourages you to learn and engage with the game's systems. The problem is that achieving the highest ranks in previous games doesn't get you anything besides at best a couple cool bonus features, so people who don't care about 100% completion likely won't bother. With Sonic Frontiers, getting the best rank and doing the side missions actually gives you valuable progression items, so a casual player has a good reason to do them even if they're not forced to. Plus, you can theoretically do every mission in a single run of a stage, which reduces the forced replays that burden the mission structure of previous games, but only if you're good enough to achieve all three criteria at once. In theory then, there's an actual incentive for skillful play that simply wouldn't be there without the open zone. All this is to say that there's a pretty strong case to be made for the concept of the cyberspace stages to return in the next open zone game. So much like with the combat, we ask ourselves, what should change about the cyberspace stages if they're here to stay? Well, for starters, these stages might not take place in cyberspace in the next game because of narrative reasons, so from now on I'll just call them action stages? Sure, that works. As I already alluded to, the action stages should not be reusing the same level themes we've been seeing for 12 years now, nor should they be reusing level layouts. It's worth noting that leveraging their pre-existing assets was probably what allowed them to make 30 different stages on top of these huge open zones, but quality over quantity is still an important principle to abide by. If the next game has fully original stages but can only accomplish that by cutting down the number of them, then I think it's a small price to pay for salvation. With that out of the way, I imagine the action stages would be organically connected to the open zone in some way. One way they could do it is to turn them into sections of the open zone so that they're not bridged by a loading screen or anything. There are already some examples of this, like the caves in Ares or Chaos Islands, or the diamond-shaped structure on Kronos Island, or other similar segments you sometimes go through to reach the Chaos Emeralds. If not that, then they could take the Sonic Adventure approach of separate stages themed around their location in the overworld. It makes sense for there to be a highway level in the city, or a beach level right next to a resort hotel. In an area called the Mystic Ruins, it's fitting to have a level where you run through some ancient temples. Doing it this way for the next open zone game would allow each action stage to have a better sense of identity with distinct themes and, again, more unique set pieces between stages. In terms of how these stages played, Sonic's control could obviously use some improvement. Most of the control changes I mentioned earlier in the video would still apply here, but there are also some cyberspace exclusive handling issues to smooth over. Make it easier to move around in midair in 3D, and reduce the delay that happens after you homing attack an enemy. In retrospect, I think those issues were both technically present in the open zone, but they weren't as noticeable. Turning while boosting could also be tighter, and or they could have manual drift as a replacement for the side loop, since, as is, it isn't usable in cyberspace. Those rolling physics in 2D should probably also be smoothed over, so that rolling would be more practical. Another quality of life tweak I'd like to see is the checkpoint time comparison feature from Generations. It would have improved the S-Rank experience, if only by a little bit. As for the level design, I think the original levels in Oranos Island are a good template to go off with, a nice mix of speed, platforming, and alternate paths, though the stage length needs some addressing. While the stages could certainly be longer, I'd argue that's not the real issue, especially given that they're a side attraction. Instead, the problem is that the stage length is very erratic and uneven. Some stages can actually last a good couple minutes, but then later you'll get one that lasts 30 seconds. The stage length should be more consistent, gradually getting longer as the game goes on. Maybe these stages would feel more developed if they combined 3D and 2D sections like like the prior Boost games did. The fact that they segregated these stages into 3D and 2D is a design choice I'm personally neutral on. It's nice and all to get some fully 3D Sonic stages for once, but I also don't see anything wrong with switching between the two perspectives in one stage. Finally, as much as I've defended the mentality behind the side missions and making them theoretically possible to do all in one try, I'd still think the threshold should have been stricter. With some very infamous exceptions, it's too easy to get most of the time and ring requirements even if you mess up, and while I don't mind the red star rings being relatively easy to get, a few are so effortless that I don't know how any player could possibly miss them. The player should be encouraged to learn the level layouts and play optimally, but they're not going to do that if they clear all 4 missions on the first try. Now, so far I've been talking about the changes I'd make to what's already in Sonic Frontiers. This next segment was going to be me listing things that weren't in Frontiers but could be implemented in the next game, but during scripting we actually got a pretty big bombshell of DLC announcements. Now, I was already predicting that we'd get some additions to the game through updates and DLC, but I was not expecting them to be this massive. Most of my suggestions are basically moot now. A jukebox, a photo mode, new challenge modes which seemingly include the ability to refight bosses, and even new playable characters? Well, dang, thanks for making my job easier. Since the DLC isn't out yet, I can't judge how these things are executed. I'm personally not expecting anything too crazy, but I can already tell they have the right idea on what needs to be added. I guess my suggestion list can be condensed down to including more of these features in the base game next time, and I have a pretty good feeling that they'll do so. Why else would they give you all this for free? Find a good way to integrate different playable characters into the main campaign, give players more things to do when they've beaten said campaign, and also include more cosmetics for Sonic to wear that you can unlock in-game. Sonic Colors Ultimate did that last one, so why can't Frontiers? Besides all that, the only other things I can suggest are the ability to rewatch cutscenes, a New Game Plus mode where you can replay the campaign with all your amassed upgrades, a super hard mode for those craving an extra challenge, and maybe some kind of special acknowledgement for 100% completion. Maybe these things will be added, but we don't have concrete evidence to suggest that yet. The second update in particular a little vague. Something else that the DLC roadmap announced is a new story segment, though we don't know yet whether or not this will be an epilogue or some other addition to Frontiers' narrative. The ending left a couple of threads for some sort of future content to pick up on, which makes story discussion fair game for this video. The mid-credits scene seems to establish that after the events of Frontiers, the core Sonic Quartet will go their separate ways, which I'm guessing means that the next game will either take place after a significant time skip or involve a completely different cast of characters. Who knows, maybe we'll get to see Shadow or Blaze or even some members of the IDW cast in the next game, or maybe the next game will have entirely new characters. Then there's the post-credits scene, which shows that Dr. Eggman has revived Sage, and this is where things get a bit dicey. It's easy to compare her sacrifice at the end of the game to Shadow's sacrifice in Sonic Adventure 2, but in this case it's more closed-ended because we already know she's coming back and there's seemingly no amnesia. They probably have some idea where her character will go from here, but as for me, I can only guess. Eggman mentions partway through Frontiers that he plans on integrating Sage into his network, but will he go through with that in the next game? If so, how will Sage respond to that? These are things to think about since we clearly haven't seen the last of her. I'm guessing that we haven't seen the last of the end either, given what it says in the final battle monologue about it being an incarnation that could take another form. Perhaps Eggman will incidentally bring it back by bringing back Sage? Other than tying up these loose ends though, I think the next game should not reference past Sonic games as often as Sonic Frontiers does. They may have done this as part of an effort to unify and re-establish the series canon, much like Sonic Adventure did 23 years prior. I've noted in the past that Sonic Adventure threw around plenty of callbacks to the games that preceded it, while Sonic Adventure 2 mostly did away with these and only loosely tied its story with Adventure 1's. I'd imagine that a follow-up to Frontiers would feel akin to Adventure 2, with some connections to Frontiers, but otherwise largely choosing to move forward with its own story and tone, without Sonic having to say, "This reminds me of the X-Grungus" every 5 minutes. Nonetheless, I still think Ian Flynn should stay on board to write the English script, although now that we have 2 games in a row that tried to be dark in tone, I honestly wouldn't mind if the next game was something lighter, akin to Heroes or Unleashed. I'd also like to see the story structure rethought so that you don't necessarily have to see all the events in a specific order. It would give the game's progression a little more room to breathe, but otherwise I don't have any specific requests for the story itself. Something I find a little bothersome is that we got a lot of CGI cutscenes in the promotional material, but none in the actual game. The in-game cutscenes cutscenes are a step up from previous games, when they're actually hand animated, but they still can't beat some classic Marza animation pointed goodness. Frankly, there's a lot about the overall presentation that I can nitpick. First are some things that people have pointed out since the first gameplay trailer. Objects often pop into existence out of thin air, and the in-game animations don't blend with each other very well, making them feel less fluid than in games like Unleashed or Generations. Granted, these things aren't as bad as they were in the original gameplay reveals, but they're nonetheless a bit distracting. A less talked about issue regards the game's camera behavior during gameplay. In many other 3D Sonic games, even the earliest ones, the camera eases in and out when it changes angles, meaning that it starts the movement slowly, speeds up, and finally slows down when reaching the desired angle. It makes the camera feel smooth and natural, yet in games like Shadow the Hedgehog, Sonic Colors, and more to the point Sonic Frontiers, the camera almost always starts and stops its movement instantaneously when changing angles, making it feel stiff and artificial. It really bugs me, and I hope the next game can change that. Can't be that hard, I mean Frontiers already kind of does it for certain timed missions in the overworld. The day and night cycle was a good addition, but it looks really off that the shadows only move at like 1 frame per second. The title screen and credits are also some of the most plain looking in the series, and I'm not sure why. The UI in general could have used a bit more spice, although I can understand wanting to go for a minimalistic look for the sake of immersion. What I don't understand is why there isn't some sort of mini-map in the HUD so that I wouldn't have to pause the game over and over when looking for memory tokens. Most of all though, I'm massively disappointed that the combo counter doesn't say things like radical, awesome, extreme, amazing when you get high enough combos. It would have been the perfect opportunity for some callbacks to Adventure 2 or Colors. See, I'm not against callbacks. That's pretty much everything I could think to talk about here. I doubt that everyone will agree with my ideas, much less do I think whatever follow-up Sonic team has for Frontiers will implement them all. They're the professionals, not me. But I also can't ignore the thought of what future Sonic games might do with Frontiers as a baseline. When it was first revealed, I was really concerned that it would end up being yet another Sonic game that would completely derail the main series in order to jump on what's trendy, but all these months later, I don't think that's being entirely fair. Instead of completely uprooting the gameplay that we're used to, Sonic Frontiers takes it in a new direction, being an evolution of the series rather than a one-time gimmick or a needless detour. I simply can't say I'm not interested in where the series goes from here when I can see a promising future offered by this game, and when the developers clearly know it. I know some people might be upset that we waited 5 years for a good first step, but I believe that's selling it a bit short. The single greatest limiting factor of every 3D Sonic game ever made seems to be how difficult it is to create levels that Sonic can just run through in 2 minutes, and a lot of the most controversial decisions in these games are only there so that they don't take an hour to beat. Sonic Frontiers is the game that finally addresses this problem at the core, and this is something that I think has gone underappreciated. Whereas previous games felt the incessant need to trim the fat or take Sonic back to his roots or whatever, the only next step after Sonic Frontiers is to grow and improve upon what's already there, but only time will tell if Sonic Team will take that next step. That concludes this video. Leave a comment down below if you've got other ideas for what you want to see in a sequel to Sonic Frontiers. Though don't expect the next video to be Sonic related, since I feel like I've reached my Sonic quota for like this decade. Thanks for watching and have a beautiful day.